Christmas arrived quietly in that small American town. Snow settled gently on rooftops and sidewalks. Warm lights glowed behind windows filled with laughter. Church bells echoed familiar melodies through the cold air. Everything looked like celebration, like belonging, like love had found its way home again. Everyone felt it, except Naomi. For Naomi, Christmas was never just a season. It was a memory wrapped in lights and silence, a reminder of promises whispered and never returned, of a door that stayed closed longer than expected, of a goodbye that never sounded final at the time. She learned that absence could echo louder than words, and Christmas always made that echo louder. She had learned how to smile in December, learned how to decorate without expecting company, how to bake for others, never for herself, how to sit through carols without letting tears fall. The town called her strong, independent, resilient. But strength, she knew, was often just survival. And survival left scars no one applauded. Years ago, Christmas had looked different. There had been plans, laughter, shared dreams. A man who promised he would never leave. A future spoken softly, like a sacred vow. Then one winter, he walked away without answers. No letter, no explanation, no return. Only silence where love once lived. His name was Carter, and Naomi stopped saying it out loud. She packed it away with old ornaments and letters, told herself that time would erase its weight, that healing meant forgetting who broke you. But Christmas has a cruel way of remembering. It brings back what the heart never released. This year, the town felt different somehow, as if the air carried something unresolved. People smiled more, but Naomi felt heavier. She didn't know why, not yet. She just felt that quiet warning inside her chest. The one that comes before old wounds reopen. The one she had learned not to ignore. While everyone prepared for celebration, Naomi prepared herself for endurance, for surviving another season of memories, for pretending that the past had no power. She believed she had moved on completely, that some chapters were closed forever, until the past decided to come looking for her. Carter returned to town without announcements. No grand entrance, no celebration, just a man carrying years of regret, eyes heavier, shoulders quieter, heart undone. He came back to a place that moved on without him, and to a woman who learned to live without answers. He never expected to face her again. But Christmas has its own language. It reunites what pain tried to keep apart. It exposes truths buried under time, and it forces hearts to choose honesty or hiding. Naomi didn't know he was back yet. She only felt the shift inside her chest, like destiny clearing its throat before speaking. This is not a story about perfect love. It is a story about broken timing, about abandonment and quiet resilience, about the cost of leaving and the courage to return, about a woman who learned to stand alone, and a man who finally understood what he lost. Their story begins where celebration meets confrontation. If you've ever been left behind without answers, if you've ever rebuilt yourself in silence, if you've ever smiled while carrying old wounds, this story is for you. Because some reunions don't come with apologies. They come with truth, fear, and trembling hope. And Christmas has a way of revealing them all. Stay with this story until the end, because not every heart is healed by time alone. Some are redeemed only when truth finally speaks, only when love chooses to stay, only when courage replaces fear. This Christmas will change everything for Naomi and Carter, and it might change something in you too. That Christmas had started like any other in Naomi's memory. The town was dressed in lights and quiet expectation. Store windows reflected snow and familiar faces passing by. Naomi believed that year would finally feel complete. Carter had promised he would be there before nightfall. His words still echoed warm inside her chest. She trusted them without hesitation. She remembered standing by the window that afternoon, watching snow fall heavier as the hours slipped away. Her phone rested silent on the wooden table. Every sound outside made her heart lift slightly. Each car passing slowed her breath with hope. She told herself not to worry. Not yet. Love, she believed, always kept its word. The house smelled of cinnamon and something unfinished. A table set for two waited patiently in the dining room. Candles stood unlit like promises waiting for fire. Naomi moved slowly, adjusting decorations again and again. Anything to avoid looking at the clock. Anything to avoid the fear rising quietly inside her. She smiled at herself and waited. Evening came softly, wrapped in cold and silence. Snow pressed gently against the windows like whispers. Church bells rang in the distance, calling families together. Naomi lit the candles one by one. Each flame burned with stubborn optimism. She told herself Carter would arrive any minute. He always did, until that night. As hours passed, the house grew heavier. The silence stopped feeling peaceful and turned sharp. Naomi sat on the edge of the couch, unmoving. Her phone remained untouched, unanswered. She resisted the urge to call again. She didn't want to sound afraid. She didn't want to believe something was wrong. Midnight arrived quietly, without apology. The candles burned low, dripping wax like tears. Outside, laughter echoed from nearby homes. Families hugged, shared gifts, shared warmth. Inside Naomi's house, the air felt hollow. She finally allowed herself to cry. Not loudly, just enough to breathe. She told herself there had to be a reason. Traffic, weather, an unexpected delay. Anything that didn't sound like abandonment. Carter had never been careless with her heart. At least, that's what she believed then. She replayed every conversation they'd had that week, searching for signs she might have missed. Morning came with pale winter light. Snow covered the streets like nothing had happened. Naomi sat awake, eyes burning, heart exhausted. Her phone still showed no message from him. No apology, no explanation, no reassurance. Just a silence louder than any goodbye. And that was when fear turned into truth. She didn't scream or throw anything. She didn't collapse dramatically to the floor. She simply stood up very slowly, folded the blanket that still smelled like him, extinguished the last candle with trembling fingers, and realized Christmas had come and gone, without Carter ever walking through that door. Days passed, then weeks, then months. Carter never returned to explain himself. No letter arrived to soften the wound. No call came to offer closure. Naomi learned that unanswered questions hurt differently. They stay longer than anger ever could. They change the way you trust forever. People asked gently what had happened. She offered vague answers and practiced smiles. Said things hadn't worked out, that life moved on. She never spoke the truth out loud, that someone she loved had simply vanished. That Christmas became the moment she stopped waiting and started surviving instead. She boxed away the ornaments they bought together, stored letters she never reread in the attic, learned how to decorate without memories attached. Every December, she did the same ritual. Smile, serve, stay busy, feel nothing. The town admired her quiet strength. No one saw the cost of it. Naomi grew older, wiser, more contained. She built a life that didn't rely on anyone, paid her bills, kept her routines, honored commitments. She became reliable in ways Carter never was. Love, she decided, was optional at best. Hope was something to handle carefully, and Christmas became something to endure. Yet something about that first Christmas never faded. It stayed like a bruise beneath healed skin. Invisible, but sensitive to the slightest touch. Every carol carried a ghost of that night. Every candle reminded her of waiting. Every promise made her pause before believing. Abandonment teaches lessons no one forgets. She never told herself she hated Carter. Hate required energy she didn't have. Instead, she practiced emotional distance. She convinced herself forgetting was forgiveness. That moving on meant erasing him completely. But the heart doesn't erase. It stores. And Christmas always unlocked the storage. Years later, Naomi would admit something quietly. That night changed more than her relationship. It changed how she measured safety, how she trusted timing and intentions, how she loved without guarantees. She became careful, observant, self-reliant, strong in ways no one celebrated. She never imagined she'd see Carter again. Not in that town, not in this life. She believed some endings were permanent by design. That closure was something you created alone. She learned to live with unanswered questions. She accepted the silence as final, and that belief carried her forward. Until now. Because the man who didn't come back that Christmas would one day return when she least expected it. Not as a hero, not as a promise, but as a reminder of what was left unresolved. And Naomi would be forced to face him. In the very season where it all began, the Christmas he never came back. After that Christmas, Naomi learned a new rhythm. It was quieter, steadier, painfully self-sufficient. She stopped waiting for footsteps at the door, stopped checking her phone with hopeful urgency. Days became something to complete, not share. Nights were for reflection, not expectation. And slowly, survival turned into routine. She returned to work with a composed smile, answered questions without inviting sympathy. People admired how quickly she moved on. They called her strong, independent, admirable. No one asked what it cost her. No one noticed how her laughter changed tone. Strength often convinces people not to look deeper. Naomi rebuilt her life with practical decisions. She organized her finances, planned her future alone. She learned how to fix small things by herself. Leaky faucets, broken shelves, silent evenings. Each solution made her more capable. Each accomplishment came with quiet loneliness. Independence grew from necessity, not desire. When December returned the following year, Naomi prepared herself emotionally in advance. She decorated earlier, before memories could interfere. She chose neutral ornaments, fewer lights. Nothing that reminded her of promises. Christmas became minimal, controlled, manageable. A season reduced to logistics and politeness. She attended gatherings but never stayed too long, left before conversations grew sentimental, before couples held hands too tightly, before someone mentioned waiting for someone else. She learned to exit gracefully. Loneliness, she discovered, was easier alone. Hope hurt more when shared. Some nights she wondered who she might have been. If Carter had returned that Christmas night, if explanations had softened the blow, if love had stayed instead of disappearing. Those thoughts never stayed long. She trained herself to redirect quickly. Dreams were dangerous when unattended. Over time, Naomi stopped telling the story. Not because it healed, but because it aged. Pain became quieter, more internal. Less dramatic, more permanent. She learned that wounds don't always close. Some simply stop bleeding, and society mistakes that for healing. She created traditions meant only for herself. Morning walks before the town woke up, coffee by the window while snow fell, music playing softly without lyrics, moments that belonged to no one else. They were small, intentional, protective. A life designed to minimize disappointment. Friends encouraged her to date again. She smiled politely and changed the subject. Romance felt unpredictable, unnecessary, risky. She preferred stability over possibility. She trusted consistency more than passion. Love, she believed, asked too much, and left too easily when it mattered most. Years passed, and Naomi changed subtly. She became more observant, less expressive. She listened more than she spoke, measured people before allowing closeness. She learned how to read silences, how to sense avoidance, hesitation, distance. Abandonment sharpened instincts love never needed. Christmas, meanwhile, kept arriving faithfully, each year carrying echoes of the first. She no longer cried when carols played, but her chest tightened without warning. Memory doesn't ask permission, it simply resurfaces when defenses are tired, and December always exhausted her defenses. Naomi became someone the town respected. Reliable, kind, emotionally composed. The woman who volunteered quietly, who helped neighbors without drawing attention. She filled spaces others neglected, not out of obligation, but understanding. Loneliness recognizes itself in others. She told herself she was content, that her life was full enough, that peace didn't require romance. She believed it most days. But sometimes, late at night, she admitted something she never shared. That independence had not erased longing. She missed being chosen without conditions, missed being someone's first thought, missed planning a future with shared language. But missing something didn't mean chasing it. She chose safety over vulnerability, control over uncertainty, and solitude over another unanswered door. By the time many Christmases had passed, Naomi no longer counted the years. She stopped marking time by absence. The past became a closed chapter. At least that's what she told herself. She believed closure could exist without answers, that some stories simply ended unfinished. She never imagined the town changing again, never expected familiar streets to feel unfamiliar. She believed predictability protected her now, that nothing would disrupt the life she built. She trusted routine more than fate. Routine had never abandoned her. Routine had never promised anything it couldn't keep. That winter, she felt unusually calm. Decorations went up without resistance. Carols played without sharpness. She believed she had finally mastered December. She didn't sense the shift yet, didn't feel the approaching confrontation, didn't know the past was already returning. Because while Naomi learned to celebrate alone, someone else learned the cost of leaving. Someone carried regret through every December. Someone finally gathered the courage to return. The life she stabilized was about to be tested, not by memory, but by presence. And everything she built would be challenged next. The town didn't announce his return. There were no signs, no warnings, no preparation. Just a quiet shift in the air that morning. Snow fell slower, heavier, as if time hesitated. Shops opened like any other December day. People went on with their routines unaware. But something old had crossed the town limits again. Carter arrived before most people noticed. His car pulled into town without recognition. No one waved, no one greeted him by name. The streets looked smaller than he remembered, familiar yet distant, like a memory losing detail. He parked near the edge of downtown and sat there longer than necessary. He hadn't planned a dramatic return. He didn't believe he deserved one. Years had passed, but guilt never loosened its grip. Every December had reminded him of what he abandoned, of a door he never knocked on again. He carried regret like a second spine, invisible, but impossible to straighten. Walking through town felt like trespassing. Every storefront reflected a version of who he used to be. Every decorated window felt accusatory. He passed the bakery they once visited together, the coffee shop where promises felt easy, the corner where he said goodbye too quickly. Memory followed him step for step. Carter had rehearsed explanations for years. None of them felt sufficient now. Fear had made his choices for him back then. Fear of failure. Fear of not being enough. Fear of staying when he felt unprepared. Leaving had felt like control. Only later did it reveal itself as cowardice. Meanwhile, Naomi moved through her day unaware. She folded sweaters in the small local store, answered customers with familiar warmth. Her movements calm, practiced, grounded. She felt no urgency, no anxiety, just an unfamiliar heaviness she couldn't explain, like a memory brushing past her without a face. She noticed it when the bells rang at noon, a pause in her chest she hadn't felt in years. She dismissed it as fatigue or cold weather. December always played tricks on emotions. She focused on work, on routine. Routine had always protected her. She trusted it more than intuition. Carter stood across the street at that moment. He hadn't expected to see her so soon. But there she was, real, unchanged, composed. Not waiting, not searching, just living. The sight struck him harder than memory ever had. She wasn't frozen in the past like he was. She had moved forward without him. He didn't approach her right away. He couldn't. His feet stayed planted while his chest tightened. This was the woman he left without explanation. The woman who waited through one Christmas alone. The woman who learned to survive his silence, and now stood strong because of it. Naomi felt it then, unmistakably. That sensation of being watched without threat. She looked up instinctively, slowly. Her eyes met his across the street. Time didn't stop. It fractured. Sound dimmed, movement blurred, breath stalled. Carter stood where memory said he never would again. Recognition came before emotion. Her mind identified him instantly. Her body reacted seconds later. Heat rushed to her face, then cold. Her hands trembled despite her still posture. This wasn't nostalgia. It was confrontation. The past had found her without permission. Carter didn't smile, didn't wave or pretend confidence. He simply stood there, visibly shaken. Older, heavier, quieter than she remembered. The man who once walked away looked broken now. Not dramatic, but unmistakably worn. Regret had aged him faster than time. People passed between them unaware. Shopping bags, laughter, casual greetings. Life continued without pausing for history. But for Naomi, the street narrowed to one point. Everything else faded into background noise. This was the moment she never rehearsed, the one she believed would never happen. Her first instinct was not anger, it was distance. Years of self-protection activated instantly. She straightened her posture and looked away. Control returned before emotion could spill. She refused to let shock decide her reaction. She had worked too hard for that. Carter felt that rejection immediately, not spoken but unmistakable. The absence he created now stood between them. He realized returning was only the beginning. That presence didn't equal forgiveness. That facing her meant accepting whatever followed, even if it was silence returned in full. Naomi finished her task with steady hands. She didn't rush outside or seek answers. She breathed slowly, deliberately. She reminded herself she owed him nothing. No explanation, no reaction, no softness. The past had no authority over her present. Or so she believed in that moment. Outside, Carter watched her walk away. The distance felt familiar, earned. This was the consequence he never faced before. Not anger, not confrontation, indifference. It terrified him more than rejection ever could. He realized then how much he had lost, and how fragile redemption would be. That night, Naomi lay awake longer than usual. Not crying, not panicking, just thinking. The life she stabilized felt suddenly vulnerable. The past was no longer memory. It had form. Carter was back, whether she wanted answers or not. And Christmas had only just begun. The real confrontation was still ahead. Naomi managed to avoid him for 2 full days, filling every hour with tasks that did not truly require her attention, but kept her safely distracted. She reorganized shelves at the store that were already perfectly aligned, volunteered for extra hours, and stayed late closing the register just to delay going home alone. Yet his presence in town lingered like a shadow she couldn't switch off. A quiet awareness sitting behind every thought she tried to control. People spoke in whispers about someone being back, though no one said his name out loud near her. It was as if the town itself respected the gravity of that history and instinctively stepped back to avoid standing in the middle. Naomi felt the weight of curiosity in every glance, but no one dared to ask whether she had seen him. She hadn't spoken a single word to Carter. Not yet. On the third afternoon, the sky darkened earlier than usual, a thick blanket of clouds swallowing the weak winter sun over the small main street. Naomi finished helping an elderly woman with her purchase, wrapping the gift with careful, practiced fingers that shook just slightly. She told herself it was just the cold, just the December air crawling into her bones. Nothing more. As she handed the package over with a soft smile, the door chimed behind the customer, letting in a gust of icy wind. She heard the bell ring again, but this time the silence afterward felt different, like the room itself was holding its breath. Without turning around, she already knew who had stepped inside, because some presences are recognized by the way your heart stumbles first. Her body registered him before her mind allowed his name to surface. "Hi, Naomi." His voice finally broke the distance, rougher than she remembered, carrying years of words he never said. She closed the drawer of the register with deliberate calm, her fingers pressing the metal just a second longer than necessary. For a heartbeat, she considered pretending not to recognize him, to act like he was just another customer passing through. But the past stood too close now, too undeniable. And denial had stopped working the moment their eyes met across the street days before. She inhaled slowly, grounding herself in the familiar creak of the floor. and the smell of pine decorations. Then she turned, not quickly, not dramatically, just with the quiet firmness of someone who had rebuilt herself brick by brick. Her eyes met his, and this time she didn't look away. Carter stood a few steps into the store, snow melting on his coat, shoulders tense as if the air itself resisted letting him come closer. He looked older, not just in years, but in the way his gaze carried shadows where laughter once lived. There were faint lines near his eyes, not from smiles but from sleepless nights and decisions he could not take back. His hands were shoved into his pockets as if he was afraid they might shake if they remained visible. For a moment neither of them spoke, and the silence sounded like all the words they never said lined up between them. Naomi didn't rush to fill that empty space. She had spent years learning how to survive in silence. He was the one who had to speak now, not her. "I know I should not be here," he started, his voice low, careful, as if one wrong syllable might shatter what little peace she had left. I needed to see you, at least once, and say something I should have said years ago." Naomi felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat, but she didn't let it escape. She'd already wasted too many emotions on his absence. Instead, she crossed her arms gently, not defensively, but like someone bracing for a storm she knew was coming. "You had years," she replied, her tone calm, almost disturbingly steady for a woman facing the man who vanished one Christmas night. "Christmas after Christmas came and went without you saying anything." "Why now, Carter?" she asked, the question cutting clean through the air. He swallowed hard before answering, his gaze dropping to the worn wooden floorboards that had seen countless customers but never this conversation. "Because I finally realized running didn't fix anything," he murmured, each word dragging guilt behind it like heavy chains. "Every December, I thought about driving back, about knocking on your door and begging you to listen, but I convinced myself you were better without me." Naomi's jaw tightened at that, her eyes narrowing slightly, anger mixing with something deeper and far more fragile. "You don't get to rewrite what you did as some kind of noble sacrifice," she said, her voice still low but now threaded with steel. "You didn't leave to protect me, Carter. You left because it was easier for you." The truth tasted bitter, but she refused to soften it for his comfort. He flinched at her words because they hit the place where his excuses no longer worked, the part of him that had replayed that night 1,000 times. "I know," he admitted, surprising her with the simplicity of those two syllables devoid of defense. "I told myself a lot of stories about why leaving was the right decision, but none of them hold up anymore. Not when I see you here, standing like this." He lifted his eyes, and for the first time Naomi saw something she hadn't expected. Not arrogance, not distance, but a quiet, unbearable regret. "I hurt you in a way I can't take back," he continued, his voice shaking just enough to betray how much that realization cost him. "And I'm not asking you to pretend it didn't happen. I need you to hear the truth, even if you walk away afterward." Naomi felt her chest tighten at the mention of truth because that was the one thing she had been denied all those years. Not love, not closure, but the simple dignity of knowing what she had done wrong, or if she had done nothing at all. "The truth?" she repeated slowly, tasting the word as if it might dissolve on her tongue like snowflakes on skin. "You think there's anything you can say that balances out disappearing on Christmas Eve and never calling again?" Her eyes shone, not with fresh tears, but with the sharp brightness of someone who had cried enough in private. "Do you have any idea what it's like to sit alone in a room full of lights, wondering if you were that easy to walk away from?" Her voice broke only on the last word, and even then, she recovered quickly. "I do now," he answered quietly, and the way he said it made her pause just for a fraction of a moment. "I spent years replaying that night, imagining you waiting, imagining the candles, the table, the way you probably kept looking at the door." He winced slightly, as if the image physically hurt him, as if the pain had finally reached him too late. "At the time, I was so tangled in my own fears that I convinced myself you were better off without someone as broken as me. I told myself you'd be hurt for a while, but then you'd move on and find someone who could actually stay." His eyes lifted again to meet hers, raw, exposed. "I never realized how arrogant and cruel that sounded until much later." Naomi looked at him for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, carrying years of unanswered questions that finally had somewhere to land. "So, instead of giving me the choice," she said slowly, each word measured, "you made it for me and disappeared. You decided I didn't get to fight for you or walk away or stay. You just removed yourself like a ghost." Her hands uncrossed as she placed them gently on the counter, grounding herself, her fingers pressing into the cool surface. "Do you know what that does to a person's sense of worth, Carter? How it makes them question every word, every promise anyone makes after that?" Her voice was not loud, but it cut deeper than any shout. He exhaled, the breath heavy with the admission he had avoided for so long. "I was a coward," he said plainly without dramatic buildup, as if the word had finally stopped fighting him. "I left because staying meant facing things in myself I wasn't ready to face, and I used you as an excuse to run from my own brokenness." He took a small step closer, not enough to invade her space, but enough to show he would not hide behind distance anymore. "You didn't deserve that version of Christmas. You didn't deserve to have your faith in people shattered just because I didn't know how to stay." His voice thickened, the words trembling in the air like fragile glass. "If I could go back and redo one night in my entire life, it would be that one." Naomi studied him, searching for lies, rehearsed lines, convenient half-truths, because she had spent years imagining what he would say if he ever returned. None of her imagined scenes had looked like this. Him standing there with shoulders low, words stripped of charm, no attempt to paint himself as misunderstood. For a second, she almost hated that honesty, because it made it harder to hold on to the clean simplicity of anger. "Do you really think a late confession fixes the way I had to rebuild my sense of worth from the ground up?" she asked softly. "I learned to go through Christmas without expecting anything from anyone, including God sometimes, if I'm being completely honest." The admission slipped out before she could stop it, startling her with its own vulnerability. "The silence you left behind didn't stay in just one room, Carter. It spread everywhere." He closed his eyes briefly at that, the pain in her words landing like blows he knew he deserved. "I can't fix the years you spent hurting," he admitted, opening his eyes again. "And I'm not asking you to pretend this conversation makes up for them. I didn't come back expecting you to forgive me on the spot, or to pick up where we left off like some cliché Christmas movie." He almost smiled at his own words, but there was no lightness in it, only a sad awareness of how naive that would be. "I came back because I realized that living with what I did in silence was no longer an option. I needed to stop being the version of myself who runs when things get hard. And that meant coming back to the place where I ran the most." Naomi felt an unexpected ripple inside her, not of forgiveness, but of recognition. Not of who he had been, but of who he might be trying to become. Change, she knew, didn't erase the past. It simply offered a different future at a very high cost. "You talk about needing this conversation for yourself," she said, her gaze steady. "But you do understand I don't owe it to you, right? I don't owe you my time, my attention, my pain, or my healing, just because you finally decided you're ready to face what you did." Her voice shook slightly now, not from weakness but from the effort of holding both boundaries and honesty in the same breath. "I spent years learning that my heart is not a place people get to visit only when it suits them. I hope you understand that I'm not the same woman you left." "I can see that," he replied quietly, and for the first time, there was a hint of something like respect in his posture, not just regret. "You're stronger, steadier, and I hate knowing that some of that strength came from learning to live without me." He paused, searching for the right words, not the easiest ones. "I'm not asking to walk back into your life like I never shattered it. I'm asking for something much smaller and maybe much harder." He hesitated, then met her eyes directly. "I'm asking for one chance to tell you everything, not the excuses, but the truth about why I left, what I went through, and who I am now. After that, you can decide if you ever want to see me again." His request hung in the air between them, fragile and heavy at the same time, like snow piling slowly on branches already bending with weight. Naomi felt a familiar instinct rise up, the urge to shut it down, to tell him no, to protect the peace she had fought so hard to build. One conversation, she knew, could reopen every wound she had carefully layered scar tissue over. But another part of her, the part that still woke up some nights wondering what had really happened, shifted uneasily. The idea of finally knowing everything both terrified and strangely relieved her, like a door she had nailed shut starting to open from the inside. She realized that avoiding the truth hadn't healed her either. It had just preserved the ache in a different shape. Silence had never answered the questions that still followed her into every December. She took a slow breath, feeling the weight of her own decision, understanding that whatever she chose now would shape not only this Christmas, but all the ones after it. "I'm not promising you anything beyond listening," she said at last, her voice firm, the boundary clear. "No apologies will erase what you did, and no explanation will magically restore who I was before that night. But I'm tired of carrying questions that only you can answer, and I'm tired of letting a night you chose define every version of me that came after." She looked at him fully, no longer trying to hide the depth of what she felt, the hurt, the exhaustion, the flicker of reluctant courage. "So if I agree to hear the truth, it will be for me, not for you. Do you understand that?" "I do," he said, and for the first time something like genuine humility settled in his features, softening the edges of guilt without erasing it. Naomi glanced at the clock on the wall, then at the crowded street outside, people hurrying past with bags and bright faces, unaware of the storm brewing quietly inside the small store. "Tomorrow," she finally said, the word tasting both dangerous and necessary. "After I close, at 7, at the cafe 2 blocks down, where conversations don't echo as much as they do in here." Her heart pounded, but her voice stayed even, as if she were confirming a simple appointment instead of reopening an old life. "If you show up, you'll tell me everything. Not the version that makes you look better, but the real one." And with that, she turned away to attend another customer, leaving Carter standing there, knowing that the next conversation would demand more honesty than he had ever given anyone in his life. The cafe felt different that evening, as if it too understood that some conversations deserved softer lighting and quieter corners. Warm bulbs hung low over wooden tables, casting amber pools over cups, notebooks, and unfinished lives. Outside, snowflakes pressed against the windows, blurring the world into gentle shapes that almost looked kind. Naomi arrived a few minutes early, not because she was eager, but because being late felt like giving the past power it didn't deserve. She chose a table in the back, far from the door, where she could see him walk in without feeling watched herself. Her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she barely tasted, using the warmth as an excuse to steady her fingers. Tonight, she would receive the answers she once begged heaven for in silence. Carter arrived exactly at 7, the door chiming softly as he pushed it open, cold air following him like a quiet accusation. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on her almost instantly, as if he had known she would choose the seat with her back to the wall. He approached with careful steps, like a man walking into a place that might collapse if he moved too fast. "Hi," he said quietly, not assuming he could greet her like before, his voice tentative, stripped of familiarity. Naomi nodded once, a minimal acknowledgement that still cost more than he knew. "You're on time," she replied, as if punctuality had ever mattered between them before tonight. "Sit. Say what you came to say." He pulled out the chair opposite hers and sat slowly, his coat unbuttoned but not fully removed, as if he wasn't sure he was allowed to stay. For a moment he just looked at her, not with nostalgia, but with the solemn awareness of someone standing in front of the consequences they avoided for too long. Naomi didn't flinch under his gaze. She had spent years learning how to hold her ground. Seeing her now, so composed, made the weight of his choices press even harder on his chest. He cleared his throat, fingers curling around his own untouched cup. "I owe you the story you never got," he began, the words heavy, unpolished. "And I'm going to tell it without trying to make myself the victim." "Good," Naomi answered simply, her voice calm, but her eyes sharp, refusing to offer him any comfort that might soften the truth. Carter nodded, more to himself than to her, and lowered his gaze for a second as if gathering fragments of a past he had avoided looking at for too long. "When we were together," he started, "I made you believe I was stable, that I knew who I was and where I was going." He let out a small, humorless breath. "The truth is I was barely keeping myself standing, pretending confidence while everything inside me was coming apart." Naomi's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. She had promised to listen, and she would. Even if every sentence pulled at an old scar. My family was a mess you never saw, he continued, his voice growing quieter, more focused. Debt, fights, expectations that didn't match reality. And me, caught in the middle, trying to be the one who saved everyone without knowing how. He swallowed hard, fingers tightening around the mug. When you and I started planning that Christmas, I was already drowning in pressure I never told you about. I got a call the day before Christmas Eve. My father had made another terrible decision, one that dragged us deeper into financial and legal problems. He asked me to leave town to meet him and fix it before it got worse, like I was some kind of shield. I said yes before I even thought about what it meant for you. Naomi felt the words hit somewhere she hadn't expected. Not because they justified his leaving, but because they added layers to a picture she had painted only in black and white. So you left to handle your family's crisis, she said slowly, wanting to hear him confirm it. Not for his sake, but for hers. I did, he admitted, but that's not the whole truth. The problem wasn't just that I left. The problem was how I left, and why I didn't call, why I stayed gone. He took a breath, his eyes glancing briefly at hers, then back to the table. When I drove out of town that night, I told myself I would call you from the road, explain everything, ask you to wait. But the more miles I put between us, the more I let fear drive for me. What were you afraid of? Naomi asked quietly, genuinely wanting the answer, even if part of her already suspected. He lifted his gaze again, and this time his vulnerability wasn't hidden by shame, just exposed, raw. Of you seeing how broken everything really was, he said without hesitation. Of you realizing I wasn't the man you thought I was. Not stable, not secure, not strong. Just scared, indebted, pulled in 1,000 directions. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I told myself that if I let you in, you'd either feel trapped in my mess or see me as a burden instead of a partner. And the idea of you looking at me with disappointment terrified me more than leaving did. Naomi absorbed his confession slowly, her fingers tapping lightly against the ceramic of her mug, the tiny motion the only sign of how much she was processing. So instead of risking my disappointment, she said, her voice steady, but edged with pain, you chose to guarantee it. You made the decision for both of us, decided I was better off without a say, and you disappeared. Her eyes shimmered, not with fresh tears, but with the clarity of someone finally naming the wound for what it truly was. You didn't protect me from your brokenness, Carter. You weaponized it and used it as a reason to abandon me. He winced but didn't argue. The truth hurt him too, but not as much as it had hurt her all these years. You're right, he answered softly. I did. He took a long breath as if diving deeper into a part of the story he had never spoken aloud to anyone. When I got to my father, things were worse than I imagined. Lawsuits threatened, debts stacked, people we owed looking for someone to blame. I stepped into chaos I didn't create, but somehow felt responsible for fixing because that's what I had always done. At first I told myself I would just stay a couple of days, fix what I could, then come right back and explain everything to you. He paused, his voice cracking slightly. But every day, something else went wrong. Another fire to put out, another lie to clean up. And the longer I stayed away, the more ashamed I became of having left you alone on Christmas. Shame, he discovered, had a way of multiplying itself. The more time passed, the harder it became to pick up the phone, he continued. I would stare at your name on the screen, thumb hovering over the call button, and all I could think was how you'd answer and say, "Where were you?" And I had no answer that didn't make me sound weak, selfish, or both. So I did the cruelest thing a person can do. I went silent, thinking avoidance would hurt less than honesty. Naomi shook her head slowly, a sad, disbelieving smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. You built an entire prison of what-ifs and locked us both inside without even letting me speak, she said. Carter nodded, the admission sitting heavy between them like a third presence at the table. I threw myself into fixing my family's mess, took extra jobs, made deals, sacrificed everything to pull us out of the hole we were in. On paper, it looked responsible. In reality, it was just another way to keep running from the damage I had done to you. Every time Christmas came, I thought about driving back, standing at your door and begging for a chance to speak. But then I'd imagine you happy, moved on, with someone who hadn't failed you, and I decided staying away was mercy. His jaw clenched, the word itself tasting wrong now. It took me years to realize that wasn't mercy. It was cowardice dressed up as care. Naomi leaned back slightly, her gaze softening not with forgiveness but with a deeper understanding of how brokenness had infected every part of his choices. "You thought you were sparing me," she said quietly, "when in reality, you were just sparing yourself from seeing the damage you caused." Her words didn't carry accusation alone, but a painful clarity that landed exactly where it was meant to. "For a long time I thought I had done something wrong," she continued. "I replayed our conversations, searched for signs you were unhappy, wondered if I had been too much or not enough." She looked out the window briefly, watching snow slide down the glass. "I didn't know your silence had nothing to do with my worth, only your fear." Her admission tightened something inside him, because it revealed the invisible wound his absence had carved into her identity. "That's the part I regret most," he said, voice thick, eyes glistening but holding back the tears that pressed stubbornly at the edges. "Not just leaving, but the way it made you question your value, your lovability, your right to be chosen and stayed for." He paused, his next words slow, deliberate. "You were never the problem, Naomi. Not for a single second. I left because I was too broken to believe I could be what you needed. And instead of saying that, I made you feel like you weren't enough. That's something I will carry for the rest of my life." The cafe around them faded into a soft blur of movement and background noise, as if the world understood that something sacred and painful was unfolding quietly at the back table. Naomi's shoulders dropped just slightly, as though a weight she had carried alone for years had finally shifted. Not gone, but at least acknowledged. She didn't rush to comfort him. This wasn't a moment for that. But she also didn't shut down, didn't shut him out completely. "Do you know what I needed that night?" she asked, her voice almost gentle now. "I didn't need you to be perfect, or to have everything together. I just needed you to tell me you were scared, and let me sit with you in it." Her words landed like a revelation he should have had long ago. "I didn't know how to let anyone do that," he admitted, the confession peeling back one more layer of his defenses. "In my family, fear was something you hid, pain was something you dealt with alone, and weakness was something people used against you. I thought I had to choose between being the strong one or being honest, and I chose strength, or what I thought was strength." He let out a breath that sounded like surrender. "If I had trusted you enough to bring you into the mess, maybe everything would have looked different. But I didn't, and that's on me, not on who you were." Naomi felt a slow ache rise in her chest, a mixture of grief for what they lost, and strange relief that the truth finally had a shape and a voice. "So you left when I needed you most," she said, summarizing his confession in one devastating sentence. "Because you didn't know how to be needed without feeling like you were failing." Carter nodded, no resistance, no dressing it up. "Yes," he answered simply. "I left because I couldn't handle the weight of your trust. I left because I thought your love deserved someone fully built, and I was still under construction." He frowned slightly, shaking his head. "But in doing that, I proved I was exactly the kind of man I never wanted to be." For a moment, the two of them just sat there in silence, the kind that didn't feel empty but full. Of hurt, of honesty, of unfinished things finally being named. Naomi looked at him, not as the boy who walked away, but as the man sitting across from her now, marked by consequences he had finally stopped outrunning. "This doesn't erase what you did," she said, making sure that line remained clear. "It doesn't mean I suddenly know what to do with you being back in this town in this season in my story." He nodded, accepting each word like a verdict he expected. "I know," he replied, "but you deserve to have the truth, even if it doesn't change your decision about me." Naomi took a slow sip of her now lukewarm coffee, letting the taste anchor her in the present, not the past. For the first time in years, the image of that Christmas night shifted in her mind. No longer a cold, empty room proving she was unworthy, but a scene interrupted by someone else's fear and generational chaos she had never seen. The pain didn't disappear, but it rearranged itself, no longer accusing her as the problem. She set the cup down gently and met his eyes. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly, surprising them both with the softness of the words. This is not forgiveness, but it is a beginning of something different than silence. And as snow continued to fall outside, Naomi realized that this Christmas would not be defined by the night he left, but by what she chose to do with the man who finally came back. In the days after their conversation at the cafe, nothing in the town seemed to change, yet everything inside Naomi felt slightly rearranged. The streets were still lined with lights. The same carols floated from store speakers and the same neighbors waved as they passed. But now, December carried a different kind of weight, not just the ache of what had happened, but the tension of what might happen next. She had finally heard the truth she had begged heaven for years ago, and it didn't erase her pain. It simply gave it a clearer outline. She no longer woke up wondering if she had been easy to discard. She knew now that his leaving had come from fear, not from her lack of worth. Yet knowing that didn't automatically soften the scar left behind. Forgiveness, she realized, was not a switch she could flip just because the story made more sense. Carter, for his part, did not push. He didn't flood her with messages or appear at her door with desperate speeches. He moved through town with quiet restraint, showing up at places where life happened but not where she was unless it was unavoidable. He helped an elderly neighbor shovel snow from their driveway, carried boxes for the store owner next door, fixed a broken step outside the bakery. People began to whisper about how much he had changed, how different his presence felt this time. But Naomi didn't measure transformation by what the town saw. She measured it by consistency over time, and time, she knew, was the only thing that could test whether this new version of him would stay. Some evenings she caught sight of him across the street, talking with someone, laughing softly, then growing quiet when his gaze brushed past the window where she stood. There was no pleading in his expression, no demands, no theatrical display of remorse. Instead, there was something deeper, something she hadn't seen in him years ago. A recognition of the damage he had caused and an acceptance that she owed him nothing in return. He didn't chase her down. He let her have her space. That alone felt like a different man than the one who had once run away when things got hard. But Naomi refused to confuse improvement with perfection. She had learned the cost of giving trust too easily. Some nights she lay awake replaying his words over and over, not to torture herself but to place each sentence in its proper place. The story of his family, the debt, the chaos, the shame, none of it excused what he did, but it did explain the shape of his choices. She found herself slowly shifting the blame she had carried on her shoulders for so long, returning it to where it belonged. She hadn't been abandoned because she was unworthy. She had been abandoned because he hadn't known how to stay. That distinction didn't heal everything, but it stopped the constant self-accusation that had marked so many Decembers. Now, when she looked in the mirror, she saw a woman who had survived the absence, not caused it. It was a subtle yet revolutionary change. One afternoon, as she was closing the store, Carter approached the entrance with hesitant steps, stopping before his hand reached for the door. He saw her inside, stacking folded scarves, her movements calm, each gesture precise, like a woman who had learned to depend on herself. He didn't barge in or wave dramatically. He waited until she noticed him and made the choice to unlock the door. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other through the glass, the barrier between them both symbolic and literal. Then, after a breath that belonged entirely to her, Naomi turned the key and opened the door halfway. "What is it?" she asked, not cold, but not eager either. Measured, as someone who had learned to protect her heart. "I'm closing soon." He nodded, accepting her boundary without resistance. "I won't keep you," he said, hands visible, posture careful. "I just wanted to ask you something, and I'll completely understand if the answer is no." She leaned lightly against the door frame, the December air creeping in around them, carrying the faint scent of snow and distant chimney smoke. "I'm listening," she replied, reminding herself that listening did not equal agreeing. Carter swallowed, the vulnerability in his eyes unmistakable. "Would you be okay if we occasionally talked? Not about us, not as if we're trying to go back, just as two people who share a town again?" The question surprised her in its simplicity. He wasn't asking for a second chance, not asking to reclaim what they had lost. He was asking for basic human contact, grounded and small. That alone made her feel the difference between who he had been and who he seemed to be becoming. Years ago, he would have either demanded forgiveness or avoided her altogether. Now he was willing to exist in the uncertain space between those extremes. Naomi considered it carefully, feeling old instincts clash with the new clarity growing slowly inside her. "I'm not ready to pretend everything is normal," she said. "But I'm also tired of living like you're a ghost every time I see you." Her words settled softly in the cold air between them. "I think," she continued, weighing each syllable, "I can be civil. We can talk sometimes. I won't punish myself by crossing the street every time you appear." Carter's shoulders relaxed imperceptibly, a quiet breath escaping him, as if he had braced for a harsher answer and found unexpected mercy. "Thank you," he said, and it sounded less like relief for himself and more like gratitude for the grace she was offering to her own life. "This doesn't mean we're okay," Naomi added quickly, not wanting any misunderstanding to root itself. "It just means I'm trying to stop letting one night keep owning every December." He nodded slowly. "I understand. And I don't expect more than that." Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't about pretending the wound never happened. It was about refusing to let it dictate every choice she made from that point on. She would not erase what he had done, but she also wouldn't let bitterness become the architect of her future. There was a difference between protecting herself and locking her heart in a room with no windows. She had done the latter for too long, calling it wisdom, when sometimes it was just fear in disguise. Now, she wanted something different. Not reckless trust, but healthy boundaries that allowed space for peace, even if that peace never led to anything more than cordial coexistence. In the following days, their interactions shifted ever so slightly. They shared brief conversations at the store when he came by to buy small, unnecessary things, like candles or a scarf he didn't really need. He never lingered or used the purchases as an excuse to stay. He simply paid, asked how she was, and left when the moment felt natural. Sometimes they crossed paths at the cafe, exchanging a few sentences about the weather, the town, the latest snowfall. There were no declarations, no emotional ambushes, just small, consistent gestures of normal human presence. Naomi found that these moments didn't drain her the way she'd expected. Instead, they slowly rewrote the way her body reacted to seeing him. The first time she laughed at something he said, a quiet, unplanned laugh that slipped out before she could catch it. Both of them froze. It wasn't a big joke, nothing profound, just an offhand comment about how the town's Christmas tree always leaned slightly to the left. But the sound that left her caught them both off guard, because it belonged to a part of her that hadn't shared space with him in years. Naomi felt a flush rise to her cheeks and immediately looked away, embarrassed by the small betrayal of her guard. "I'm sorry," she muttered, not even sure what she was apologizing for, laughing or letting him hear it. "Don't be," he said gently, his voice softer than the lights outside. "I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful you still have that in you." That night, lying in bed, Naomi thought about how strange the heart could be. The same person who had once shattered her ability to trust was now the one standing in front of her with more humility than she'd ever seen in any man. She didn't romanticize it. She knew that redemption didn't erase damage. It simply offered a different way of moving forward. But she also knew that her healing was no longer about punishing him. It was about freeing herself. Holding on to her anger had once been the only thing that made her feel in control. Now, she felt a different kind of strength growing, the kind that could look at the past without letting it define every part of her future. Forgiveness, she began to see, might be less about forgetting and more about releasing. She didn't wake up one morning suddenly free of bitterness. Some days, a smell, a song, or the way the light hit the snow would drag her back to that first Christmas he never came back. On those days, seeing him in town was harder. The ache returned sharper, memories clearer. But even then, she noticed something had shifted. She no longer attached those moments to her own inadequacy. Instead, she saw them for what they were, echoes of a wound caused by someone else's fear. She allowed herself to feel the hurt without judging it, without telling herself she should be over it by now. Healing, she understood, followed no calendar. Carter didn't expect her progress to be linear either. There were days she was open, responsive, almost light around him, and others when she kept her answers short and her gaze distant. On those days, he didn't press, didn't ask what he did wrong. He already knew what he had done long ago. Instead, he simply continued showing up in small, grounded ways, finishing repairs he started, keeping promises he made to others, staying when things were heavy. He was learning that redemption wasn't a performance. It was quiet consistency when no one was clapping. He didn't know if Naomi would ever fully forgive him, but he knew that who he became now mattered, whether or not she chose to stay in his life. One evening, as they both left the cafe at the same time, the street unusually empty, snow falling in soft curtains around them, Naomi slowed her steps. They walked side by side for a short distance, their breaths visible, their silence companionable rather than suffocating. "Do you ever wish you could forget?" she asked suddenly, her eyes fixed on the glow of the street lamp ahead. Carter took a moment before answering, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I used to," he admitted. "I used to wish I could erase that night, erase what I did to you, erase the years that followed. But if I forgot, I'd probably make the same choices again, just with someone else paying the price. I think remembering is part of what keeps me from becoming that man ever again." His answer surprised her, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest in a way that didn't center his comfort. "I don't want to forget either," Naomi said quietly, more to herself than to him. "Not because I like the pain, but because it taught me things about myself I wouldn't have learned otherwise." She exhaled, watching her breath dissolve into the cold air. "It showed me I can survive what I thought would break me. It taught me that my value doesn't depend on someone staying." She glanced at him briefly. "And it reminded me that my heart still wants truth, even when truth hurts." They reached the corner where their paths separated, his route leading uphill toward the small inn where he was staying, hers toward the modest house she had filled with her own traditions. For a moment, neither moved, suspended in the strange familiarity of being together yet not together. "Naomi," he said softly, her name carrying gratitude rather than claim. "I know forgiveness is a journey, and I don't expect to be there at the finish line with you." His eyes were steady, accepting. "But if there's ever a place for me in the version of your life where you don't flinch when you hear my name, I'll be thankful just to exist there." He paused. "Even if that's all it ever is." She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, she saw not just the boy who had broken her, but the man who was trying to live differently within the consequences of his past. "I don't know where this goes," she admitted, refusing to offer promises her heart wasn't ready to keep. "But I know this. I don't hate you. Not anymore." The words felt strange and liberating on her tongue, as if a door inside her had opened just a fraction. "This doesn't mean I've forgiven everything," she added, her boundaries still firm. "But maybe it means I'm not going to let what you did continue to decide who I am." And as she walked away under the falling snow, Naomi realized that this too was a kind of forgiveness. Not forgetting, not excusing, but finally choosing herself over the pain. In the past, staying had always been theoretical for Carter, a word he used freely without understanding its cost. He had said things like, "I'm not going anywhere," with the ease of someone who never imagined being tested. Now staying meant something entirely different. It meant waking up each day in the same small town he once fled. It meant walking by the same streets that knew his absence as well as his name. It meant seeing Naomi regularly and accepting that she might never fully let him back in. This time, staying wasn't a promise he made with his mouth. It was a decision he made with his feet. He could have left after that conversation at the cafe, disappeared again under the excuse that, at least she heard the truth. Part of him knew it would be easier to move on, to build a new life somewhere no one knew what he had done. But easy was the language of the old him, the one who believed distance was a solution. The man he was trying to become understood something different. Repair required proximity, not escape. So he extended his stay at the small inn, taking on part-time work around town to afford remaining there longer. He fixed things that were broken, both for money and for something deeper in himself. This time, when life grew uncomfortable, he did not run. Naomi noticed even when she pretended she didn't. She saw how often he showed up to help without being asked, carrying boxes for Mrs. Evans, repairing the broken handrail outside the library, unjamming the old store's front door. He never announced what he was doing, never made speeches about changing or making up for the past. He just quietly stepped into the spaces where something needed to be done and did it. People started commenting on how dependable he'd become, how much lighter his presence felt. But Naomi measured consistency over whispers. She watched, waited, and let time do what apologies never could. One afternoon, a heavy snowstorm was announced, the kind that turned their small town into a white maze where roads blurred into one another. Most people rushed home early, closing shops before the sky grew too dark. Naomi stayed at the store a little longer, double-checking inventory and securing decorations in case the wind picked up. She hadn't realized how quickly the snow was falling until she looked outside and saw the street nearly empty. Her stomach tightened as she imagined walking home alone in the thickening storm. She had done it before, but something about that night felt different. It felt like the kind of storm that didn't care who was ready. As she locked the door and stepped into the swirling white, the wind slapped her face with cold, stinging against her cheeks. The world had gone quiet, that eerie silence that comes when snow absorbs sound, leaving only the crunch of careful steps. She wrapped her coat tighter around her and started walking, the familiar path to her house suddenly feeling longer than usual. Halfway down the street, she slipped slightly on a patch of ice, catching herself just in time by grabbing a lamppost. Her heart raced, not just from the slip, but from the dizzying awareness of how alone she felt in that moment. Then she heard footsteps behind her, steady and unhurried. "Careful," a voice called out gently. "The path gets worse up ahead." She didn't need to turn around to know who it was, but she did anyway. Snowflakes clinging to her eyelashes as she looked over her shoulder. Carter stood a few steps back, scarf wrapped around his neck, hat dusted with snow, hands out of his pockets as if ready to help but waiting for permission. "I'm fine," she said, a reflex more than a statement, her pride still intact even when her footing wasn't. "I know," he replied, not challenging her, his voice steady in the cold air. "But I also know this road, and I'd feel better walking behind you just in case you slip again." He didn't move closer, didn't extend his hand without being asked. He simply offered his presence like a safety net she didn't have to use. Naomi hesitated, staring at him through the swirl of falling snow. Old habits told her to refuse, to insist she didn't need anyone, to protect herself from even the smallest gesture that might stir something warmer. But another part of her, the one learning that strength didn't always mean doing everything alone, softened just enough. "Fine," she said at last, turning forward again. "But if I fall, and you laugh, I'm pushing you into a snowbank." He let out a soft chuckle, the sound cutting through the cold like a fragile line of warmth. "Deal," he answered. And so they walked. She in front, he a few steps behind, not leading, not directing, just quietly staying. The path grew steeper near the corner where her street turned, snow piling deeper with each minute. Naomi's boots sank into the white, making it harder to keep her balance. At one point, her foot slid again, and this time she felt herself tilting backwards, breath catching sharply. Before she hit the ground, strong hands caught her elbows, steadying her without pulling her too close. "You're okay," Carter murmured, his voice close to her ear, calm and present. For a moment, they stood there frozen, not because of the cold, but because of the old memory echoing beneath the new moment. The last time she had needed him, he hadn't been there. Now, he was. She straightened slowly, stepping out of his hands on her own, reclaiming her balance. "Thanks," she said quietly, the words small but sincere, visible in the cloud of breath between them. He nodded, not making it bigger than it was. "No problem," he replied. "I meant what I said. I just wanted to make sure you got home without cracking your head on the sidewalk." There was no heroism in his tone, no attempt to make the moment about his redemption, just simple concern, grounded and real. They continued walking, the distance between them now filled with something gentler than before. When they reached her house, the porch light shone like a small star in the snow-dimmed evening, warmth spilling from behind the curtains inside. Naomi stopped at the bottom of the steps and turned to face him, snowflakes melting against her eyelashes. "You didn't have to walk me all the way," she said, though a deeper part of her was grateful that he had. "I know," Carter answered, "but I wanted to, and not because I felt guilty, though I still do, but because staying near when things are difficult is the person I want to be now." His words settled over the moment like a blanket, simple but sincere. She studied him, searching for performance and finding only exhaustion and quiet resolve. "This is where you turn back," she said softly. "At least for tonight." He nodded, accepting her boundary as easily as if she had pointed out a physical fence. "I'll head back," he replied. "The inn isn't too far. And don't worry, I won't start lurking around your porch like some kind of tragic Christmas ghost." The small joke made her lips twitch despite herself. "Good," she answered. "I'd have to call the sheriff and tell him the decorations were being haunted." He smiled then, a real unguarded smile that made him look a little more like the man she once loved, and a lot more like the man he was becoming. "Good night, Naomi," he said softly. "Good night, Carter," she replied, and for the first time it didn't feel like an ending, just a pause. Inside her house, as she took off her boots and unwrapped her scarf, Naomi let herself replay the walk home, not as evidence of some dramatic transformation, but as a quiet vignette of what it meant for someone to simply stay. She realized he hadn't tried to bring up the past or push her into emotional conversations in the storm. He had just shown up when the path was slippery, kept pace with her, and made sure she arrived safely. No promises, no speeches, just presence. For a woman who had once spent Christmas night staring at a door that never opened, that simple act was not small. It was, in its own way, sacred. Over the next days, his choice to stay showed up in other ways. When a pipe burst in the back room of the store, he arrived with tools before she even finished calling the plumber. When the town needed volunteers to set up extra chairs for the Christmas Eve service, he was the first to arrive and the last to leave. He stayed late to help the older residents walk home safely when the sidewalks turned icy. He didn't narrate his efforts, didn't post about them, didn't point them out. He simply moved through the town like someone committed to being reliable. Slowly, people stopped referring to him only as the one who left. Naomi still guarded her heart, but she no longer had to guard every interaction. She could talk to him in public without feeling like every eye in the room was dissecting their history. They discussed simple things: the best hot chocolate in town, the school's Christmas play, whether the snow would stop before the roads closed completely. Sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, part sorrow, part gratitude, part quiet wonder that she still shared any words with him at all. She didn't encourage it, but she didn't shut it down either. Instead, she let the tension exist, unnamed but acknowledged. Healing rarely grew in spaces where everything was forced into neat labels. One evening, the town gathered for a small pre-Christmas market, with stalls set up around the square, offering handmade crafts, hot drinks, and carols sung by bundled-up children. Naomi walked through the crowd alone, as she often did, enjoying the lights and the smell of cinnamon and roasted chestnuts. At one point, she stopped to adjust a crooked ornament on a small tree set up near the fountain. When she straightened, she saw Carter across the square, helping a little boy lift a cup of hot cocoa without spilling it. He wasn't looking for her. He didn't even know she was watching. For the first time, she saw him simply as a man doing good, not as a man trying to impress her. And that strangely made her trust him just a fraction more. Later that night, as the crowd thinned, the mayor asked for volunteers to help take down the stalls before the weather shifted. Naomi stepped forward automatically, as she always did, and was unsurprised to see Carter step up as well. They ended up working side by side, folding tables, carrying boxes, their movements easy and in sync, despite the history between them. At one point, as they lifted a particularly heavy crate, their hands brushed, neither of them dropping it, neither pulling away. The touch was brief and steady, not electric, not dramatic, just real. "Thank you for staying to help," she said once they set the box down. "I told you," he answered, looking at her with quiet conviction. "I'm trying to be someone who stays, especially when it's not glamorous." That night, as Naomi lay in bed, she thought about how love stories were often told as if everything changed in a single conversation, a single apology, a single grand gesture. But what she was experiencing didn't look like that at all. It looked like small, repeated choices. Walking her home in a storm, fixing a pipe, showing up early, leaving when she asked, listening when she spoke. It looked like a man who no longer chased comfort, but chose consistency instead. And it looked like a woman who refused to rush herself into forgiveness but also refused to stay chained to old pain. If this ever became redemption, it would not be built on fireworks. It would be built on footprints that refused to walk away. Standing at her window, watching snow fall softly over the quiet town, Naomi wrapped her arms around herself and let a thought surface she had been too afraid to name. Maybe, just maybe, this Christmas wasn't about pretending the past hadn't happened. It was about witnessing what someone did after finally facing it. She didn't know yet if her story with Carter would end in friendship, distance, or something that looked like love redeemed. What she did know was this: he was still here, not demanding, not retreating, simply choosing to remain where his absence had once caused the most damage. And for the first time, the idea of him staying no longer felt like a threat. It felt like the beginning of a choice she might one day be ready to make too. Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in the kind of stillness that only small towns know, where every window glowed and every street seemed to be holding its breath. Snow had fallen through most of the afternoon, leaving the world softened, edges blurred as if the past itself had been dusted white. Naomi stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the simple, dark green dress she had chosen for the evening service at the church. She had worn it before on other Decembers, but tonight it felt different on her skin, less like armor and more like presence. Her hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, not styled for anyone in particular, just done as a quiet act of self-respect. She stared at her reflection, searching for fear, but finding instead a steady, nervous courage. This Christmas, she knew, would not be like the others. Downstairs, the house smelled faintly of cinnamon and pine, the small tree in the corner glowing with warm white lights. Naomi paused near it, fingers brushing an ornament she and Carter had bought together years ago, one she had almost thrown away more times than she could count. Instead, she had buried it in the bottom of a box, and this year, on a strange impulse, she had brought it back out. It hung low on the tree now, not as a tribute to what they'd been, but as a witness to everything she had survived. She touched it once, then stepped back, inhaling slowly, as if breathing in her own story. "I'm not that girl anymore," she whispered softly into the quiet room. And tonight is not about waiting by a door. The church was already filling when she arrived, the warm hum of voices and rustle of coats wrapping around her as she stepped inside. Candles lined the aisles, their flames flickering gently, casting soft halos on the polished wooden pews and worn hymn books. Children fidgeted in their festive clothes. Parents whispered reminders to behave. Elderly couples sat close, hands folded or intertwined. Naomi slipped into a pew near the middle, close enough to see the front, far enough not to feel on display. She greeted familiar faces, received hugs, accepted well wishes for a blessed Christmas with a genuine, if small, smile. For a moment, she let herself just be another person in the crowd, not the woman carrying a history with the man everyone knew had returned. And then she felt it, that almost tangible awareness that she was no longer alone in her row. Carter slid into the space at the far end of the same pew, leaving a respectful distance between them, as if physically acknowledging all the ground they were still crossing. He wore a simple dark coat over a sweater, his hair still dusted with snow that hadn't fully melted before he stepped inside. When their eyes met briefly, he didn't smile too widely, didn't overplay the moment. He just nodded once. "Merry Christmas, Naomi," he said quietly, his voice barely above the murmur of the congregation. She inhaled, feeling the words land somewhere deep, where both old pain and new possibility resided. "Merry Christmas, Carter," she replied, steady enough that she surprised herself. The organ began to play softly, cutting off any need to say more just yet. As carols filled the space, Naomi found herself listening to the lyrics differently this year. Words about light coming into darkness, about hope arriving after long silence, about peace given to hearts that had forgotten how to rest. She had sung these songs before, but now they collided with the story of her own life in a way she could not ignore. She glanced sideways once, catching Carter's profile in the flickering candlelight, his eyes fixed not on her, but on the front, expression open, unguarded. He looked like a man who knew he didn't deserve a second chance at anything, and yet was grateful just to be breathing in the same room as one. For the first time, she wondered not who he had been, but who he might become if he kept choosing courage over escape. The thought scared her and warmed her at the same time. Midway through the service, the pastor invited everyone to reflect on what they needed to let go of this year and what they were willing to receive instead. Murmurs fell away, replaced by the collective hush of dozens of hearts turning inward at once. Naomi closed her eyes, the soft glow of candles painting a faint warmth against her eyelids. She thought of the girl she had been that first Christmas he never came back, hopeful, unguarded, shattered in a single night. She thought of the woman she had become, strong, careful, deeply rooted in herself, even when loneliness pressed in close. "I don't want to live defined by absence anymore," she admitted silently. "If love ever enters my life again, let it be because I chose it awake, not because I stayed frozen in fear." When she opened her eyes, the congregation was rising for another hymn, and she did too, though her legs felt a little unsteady. Her voice joined the others, shaky at first, then stronger, not because she believed every line perfectly, but because she wanted to. Beside her, Carter sang quietly, not with impressive volume, but with an earnestness that made his voice sound almost reverent. There was no performance in him tonight, no desire to be seen as redeemed in the eyes of the town. He simply looked like a man grateful to not be spending another Christmas hiding from the place he broke. Naomi didn't know what watching him like that meant yet, but she knew it was different from the way she had watched anyone in a long time. After the service, people spilled out into the crisp night air, laughter and conversation rising in little clouds of breath under the glow of lampposts. Someone had set up a table with hot chocolate and cookies, and children ran around in the snow, scarves streaming behind them like moving ribbons. Naomi stepped outside into the cold, pulling her coat tighter, unsure whether she wanted to leave immediately or linger like everyone else. Behind her, she heard footsteps, then Carter's voice, gentle, not assuming. "Would it be okay if I walked with you for a bit?" he asked. She turned, searching his face for pressure or expectation, and found only quiet hope. "Yes," she said finally. "For a bit." They walked away from the crowd, the sounds of the Christmas Eve celebration fading behind them as they turned down a quieter street. Snow crunched beneath their boots and the night sky stretched above them, deep and starless like a velvet curtain keeping the world small and close. For a while, neither of them spoke, and this time the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like a space they were both allowed to breathe in. They passed houses with windows glowing warmly, glimpses of families gathered around tables, exchanging gifts, sharing stories. Naomi felt a twinge of something like longing, but it didn't sting the way it once had. Her life might not look like those scenes, but it wasn't empty. Not anymore. Not with the truth finally spoken. And not with someone walking beside her who had once walked away. "Thank you for not leaving after everything we talked about," Naomi said at last, surprising herself with the honesty of her words. Carter glanced at her, taken aback, as if he hadn't expected gratitude of any kind to come from her mouth in his direction. "I thought about it," he admitted quietly, his breath visible between sentences. "I thought maybe it would be easier for you if I did, that I'd done enough just by explaining and then making room for you to move on without seeing me." He looked ahead, his expression reflective. "But then I realized that part of my problem has always been running when things were halfway, not giving anything the time it deserves to grow or heal. So this time, I decided I'd rather stay and handle the discomfort than leave and live another decade wondering what might have happened if I'd stayed." She watched him as he spoke, the honesty in his words sinking into places inside her that had long been guarded. "You have changed," she said softly, not as a compliment, but as an observation she could no longer deny. "Not in a dramatic movie way, but in the way you move, the way you listen, the way you accept my boundaries without trying to bend them." He smiled faintly, almost self-conscious. "I had to," he replied. "The man I was before. He didn't know how to love without control or fear. He didn't know how to stay when things weren't easy." He stopped walking then, turning to face her fully under the soft light of a street lamp. I don't know what I am to you now or what I ever will be again, but I know who I don't want to be anymore." The snow continued to drift around them, catching in his hair and on her lashes, as if the night itself were staging the scene, though neither of them were thinking about how it looked. Naomi's heart beat a little faster, not with panic but with the weight of the moment pressing gently against her ribs. "I can't promise you anything big tonight," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt inside. "I can't promise that I'll fall back in love with you, or that I'll wake up tomorrow a completely healed person with no fear of being hurt again." She took a small breath, grounding herself in the truth of her own words. "But I also don't want to pretend I feel nothing when I look at who you're trying to be now. There is something in me that doesn't want to close the door completely anymore." His eyes softened at that, humility mixing with a glimmer of emotion he was careful not to let spill into pressure. "Naomi, I don't need a guarantee," he said quietly. "I don't need you to tell me that we're getting back together, or that everything is forgiven tonight just because it's Christmas Eve." He swallowed, the vulnerability in his gaze deepening. "What I need, what I hope for, is simply a chance to keep showing up, to keep proving over time that staying is real for me now." He hesitated, then added, "And if somewhere along that path your heart ever chooses me again, it will be because you want to, not because you feel obligated by the past. That's the only kind of love I ever want from you." Something in her loosened then, like a knot pulled tight for years finally beginning to release, thread by thread. For so long she had imagined that if he ever returned, he would try to reclaim what they had, to demand what he once walked away from. But this man standing in front of her wasn't claiming anything. He was simply standing in his own honesty, offering her freedom instead of expectation. That, more than any apology, began to feel like redemption. Not because it magically erased what had happened, but because it honored the woman she had become in the aftermath. "You're right," she said softly. "If my heart ever chooses you again, it has to be as the woman I am now, not the girl who waited by the window. And she doesn't move quickly, but she is listening." A quiet smile touched his lips, not victorious, but deeply, almost reverently grateful. "Then I'll keep living in a way that respects her pace," he replied. "I don't want to rush you, Naomi. I want to match the rhythm of the healing you're walking through, even if that means I stand on the edges of your life far longer than my heart would prefer." The honesty of that admission made her chest ache in a strangely tender way. She realized that for the first time in years she wasn't just defending herself from him. She was also allowing herself to feel hope without immediately shaming it. The past hadn't vanished, but the future no longer felt blocked by it. For the first time there was more than one possible ending to their story. They reached the small park near her street, the bench where they had once sat on a much younger winter night, making plans for a future that never came. The bench was dusted with snow now, untouched, as if it had been waiting quietly for them to decide whether to reclaim it or walk past. Naomi paused beside it, her breath catching slightly at the memory of their younger selves. Innocent, untested, unaware of how fragile promises could be. "We were so sure back then," she murmured, half to herself, "that we knew what love meant, that it was all warmth and right words and easy laughter." She looked at him, eyes clear. "Now I think love is this. Difficult, slow, honest. Not always pretty, but real." Carter followed her gaze to the bench, then back to her, his own expression reflecting the same mixture of grief and gratitude. "Can I ask you something?" he said softly. If this moment had happened years ago, before everything, we probably would have kissed just because the scene looked perfect. Snow, Christmas, a park, us." He gave a small, self-aware smile. "But if I kissed you now, it would never be about the scene. It would only be because your heart chose it, not because of timing or nostalgia." He stepped half a pace closer, not touching her, eyes searching her face. "So I'm asking, honestly, without pressure, do you want that?" Naomi's heart pounded hard enough that she could feel it in her throat, but there was no sense of being cornered, only invited. She thought of the girl who had once waited by the window and knew she was no longer that girl, and she would not answer for her. She thought of the woman she had become, the one who had listened to truth, watched growth, and chosen herself every step of the way. And standing there, snow falling softly around them, she realized something quietly overwhelming. She did want to know how it felt to say yes as this woman, not as a wounded version of herself. She stepped closer, closing the distance that he had been careful not to cross. "Yes," she whispered, voice steady with newly claimed choice. "But this time it's not because I'm afraid of losing you. It's because I'm not afraid of myself anymore." When their lips finally met, it wasn't a rushed, movie-perfect kiss. It was slow, trembling, layered with history and hope. The kind of kiss that didn't erase the past but gently began to rewrite what Christmas meant for both of them. In the days that followed that Christmas Eve, the town went back to its usual rhythm. Lights slowly dimming, decorations coming down, streets returning to their quieter colors. But inside Naomi, something remained lit. A small, steady flame that wasn't there before the snow, the walk, the kiss under the street lamp. It wasn't a fire of blind passion, or the dizzy rush of a second chance promised too quickly. It was something gentler, deeper, the quiet awareness that her heart had chosen with eyes open this time. She went back to work, folded sweaters, greeted customers, swept the same floors. Yet every ordinary moment now carried the subtle echo of one truth. She was no longer living as the woman abandoned at Christmas. Carter, too, returned to the same streets, the same inn, the same routines he had built in the weeks since coming back. But now, each morning felt different, not because his guilt vanished, but because grace had entered the story alongside it. He still helped shovel snow, still volunteered, still repaired what was broken when he could. Only now, his efforts weren't fueled by desperation to be seen as changed, but by genuine desire to live differently. He knew one kiss didn't guarantee anything. It wasn't a contract. It was an invitation. An invitation to keep choosing courage instead of fear. To keep staying even when the next steps weren't promised. Naomi didn't wake up transformed into someone who trusted completely overnight. There were mornings she remembered the old ache more clearly, afternoons when a stray memory made her chest tighten unexpectedly. She allowed those moments to exist without judging herself for them. Healing, she had learned, was not a straight line or a clean break. But now, when the pain resurfaced, it didn't accuse her value. It simply reminded her of where she'd been. And every time she could look around and see proof that she was not there anymore. Her present no longer bowed to the ghost of one unanswered Christmas. They didn't rush into labels or declarations. There was no announcement to the town. No sudden reappearance as a couple in every public place. Instead, there were slow, intentional steps, shared coffees, walks through the snow as winter began to soften, small conversations about big things. They talked about fear and failure and faith, about who they were then and who they were trying to be now. Naomi did not shrink back to make him feel bigger. She stayed fully herself, grounded and clear. Carter did not try to erase the past with charm. He let its weight stay visible, so he never forgot the cost of his choices. This was not a story of back to how it was. It was a story of forward into something new. Some nights, Naomi sat by her window with a mug of tea, watching the last of the snow melt along the edges of the sidewalk. She thought of the girl who once stood there, heart in pieces, wondering what was wrong with her. And she thought of the woman she was now, heart still tender, but no longer defined by who stayed or left. She realized something quietly beautiful. Even if Carter had never returned, her growth would still have mattered. Her resilience, her strength, her ability to rebuild a life. Those things were not dependent on him. His return, however, gave her a different kind of gift. The gift of seeing herself choose love again, without abandoning herself this time. Carter often found himself walking past the church, even when there were no services, just to sit on the steps for a while. He didn't know how to fully explain it, but something had shifted inside him that night under the street lamp. For years, he believed redemption was something you begged for in one desperate moment. Now, he saw it differently, not as a dramatic rescue, but as a long obedience in the same direction. Staying, showing up, owning his past without letting it dictate his future. He knew he might never completely stop regretting what he had done, but regret no longer chained him to who he used to be. As winter slowly loosened its grip, the town transitioned from white to gray and then to the first hints of green. Naomi and Carter's story didn't suddenly become effortless. There were hard conversations, honest questions, and moments of hesitation. There were days when she needed space and took it, and he stayed respectful. There were days when he struggled with worthiness, wondering if he had any right to hope, and she answered with truth, not flattery. They built something not on promises of perfection, but on agreements to tell the truth even when it was uncomfortable. And slowly, the distance that had once been only loss began to make room for learning how to love without erasing what hurt, and yet not worshiping the hurt either. Christmas, Naomi realized, had not changed the past. It hadn't rewritten the night he didn't come back, hadn't undone the years she spent rebuilding alone. Those chapters remained part of her story, ink dried and permanent on the pages behind her. But this Christmas had done something else, something quieter, wiser. It had changed the way she carried those chapters, how she read them, how she allowed them to speak into who she was now. The old Christmas said, "You were not worth staying for." This Christmas answered, "You were always worth it. He just wasn't ready." And that was about him, not you. For women like her, women who had been left, forgotten, or forced to start over when they least expected, Naomi's story held a new kind of mercy. It didn't promise that every man would come back, or that every relationship would be restored. Life, she knew, was not that neat, and hearts deserved more honesty than fairy tales that ignored real pain. But her story did reveal something unshakable. Abandonment does not define a woman's worth. Silence does not get the last word on her identity. And even when love returns, she has the right to choose slowly, wisely, with her head and her heart awake. Redemption, she learned, starts inside, long before it appears in someone else's eyes. On a quiet evening months later, as they walked through the town with no snow, only soft streetlight and early spring air, Naomi realized something simple and profound. She was not walking beside him because she was afraid of being alone. She was walking beside him because she trusted the woman she had become, the one who could say yes or no without losing herself. And that trust, more than any apology, was the true miracle of their story. Carter, sensing the shift without needing it explained, matched his steps to hers without rushing ahead. He had once defined love as being chosen. Now he understood that real love was also about being consistent enough to be chosen again and again. Christmas hadn't magically repaired their history or erased the scars, but it had given them a moment, a holy pause in the middle of pain and memory, to decide who they would be next. Naomi chose not to live as the woman whose story ended at the door that never opened. Carter chose not to live as the man who spent his life apologizing from far away. Instead, they stepped into a future that did not deny the past, but refused to be ruled by it. A future where love meant staying, listening, confessing, and choosing each other with full awareness of the cost. A future where redemption was not a scene, it was a process. In the end, Christmas did not change what had happened, but it did something infinitely more powerful. It changed the hearts that carried it. Naomi's heart, once shattered and silent, now beat with a steady confidence in her own worth, whether loved or left. Carter's heart, once ruled by fear and flight, now learned the steady rhythm of staying, even when uncertain. And somewhere in the quiet, in the ordinary days that followed the lights and the songs, love began to look less like a promise never tested, and more like two imperfect people choosing to walk forward hand in hand, knowing full well what it cost to stay. Christmas didn't erase their story. It redeemed the way it would be told from here on.